That morning in late October, I printed a 3-day notice at my kitchen table and walked across the yard to the cottage. Evelyn Marsh was 3 months behind on rent, and I'd rehearsed what to say twice in the truck, but she didn't take the paper and she didn't beg. She said she had a different idea, that she'd take care of the house and take care of me if I'd let her stay. I didn't give her the notice, and I didn't know it yet, but the quiet life I'd built was about to change direction. My name is Frank Dalton. I'm 34, and I live alone in a small house on Millbrook Lane at the edge of a town called Ridgewood, about 40 minutes outside of Portland. The house is a 2-story place with white siding and a porch that needs repainting every 3 years, whether I get to it or not. Behind the main house, separated by a strip of grass and an old oak tree, there's a cottage. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that fits a card table, and not much else. That cottage is the only thing that brings in money I can count on. I inherited both buildings from my parents. They bought the property in the 1982nd when this part of Oregon was still farmland, and nobody wanted to build out here. My father fixed everything himself. He taught me to use a hammer before I could ride a bike. When they passed, the house came to me, and the mortgage came with it, and the cottage became a rental unit that pays just enough to keep the whole thing standing. I work as a handyman around town, small jobs for the most part. Leaky faucets, broken hinges, drywall patches, the kind of repairs that don't take a license, but take someone who shows up on time and doesn't complain. I like the work. A crooked hinge can be straightened, a missing screw can be replaced. People are harder. Tools don't lie to you, and tools don't leave. You fix something right, it stays fixed. My wife Karen left me 5 years ago. We'd been married 3. She said I was too quiet, too still, that living with me felt like living in an empty room. She wasn't cruel about it, she was honest, and that was worse. She packed her things on a Tuesday and moved to Salem with the man she'd met at her office. I didn't fight it. I didn't know how to fight for something I couldn't name. After she left, I stopped using the dining room and stopped sitting at the kitchen table. I ate standing up at the counter, whatever was quick, and I kept the cottage rented to whoever answered the ad. A retired couple came first, then a young man who worked at the lumber yard, then no one for a while, and then Evelyn Marsh moved in. The house hasn't changed much since Karen's departure. Same furniture, same curtains, same quiet that presses against the walls at night. I keep everything clean, and I keep everything working, and if that's not the same as living, it's close enough to fool yourself on most days. Evelyn moved in 6 months ago, early April. She was 24, dark hair that fell past her shoulders, and she had a way of looking at you that made you feel like she'd already figured something out you hadn't said yet. Her shift at Rosie's, the diner downtown, ran late most nights, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that stays hot no matter how long you sit there. When she signed the lease, she told me she'd come from a small town 2 hours north, looking for a fresh start. I didn't ask what she was starting over from, because that wasn't my business. For the first 3 months, she paid on time, leaving the rent in an envelope tucked under the flower pot by the cottage door, always cash, always exact, and she left small things on my porch sometimes. A jar of homemade blackberry jam with a note that said, "Thanks for fixing the sink," a packet of sunflower seeds in May when she noticed I was planting along the fence line. Little gestures that didn't ask for anything back. I noticed her the way you notice someone who lives 30 feet from your back door. She'd walk home from the diner at 11 or midnight, her shift ending late, and sometimes I'd see her from the kitchen window under the porch light, moving slow and steady through the dark. She never asked for a ride, never complained about anything. She kept to herself the way I kept to myself, And that seemed like a fair arrangement between two people who didn't need much from each other. Then the payments stopped. July came and went with no envelope under the flower pot, and August was the same. I left a note on her door, polite, just asking if everything was okay, but got no answer. September came and went with still nothing paid, and she was 3 months behind. I left another note, this one clearer, but still no response. The mortgage doesn't care about kindness, and the bank doesn't accept jam in place of cash. I'm not a cruel man. I know what it's like to be short, to count coins at the grocery store and decide what you can live without. But I can't carry someone else's weight when I barely carry my own. The cottage helps pay for the property. Without that income, I'm one bad month away from trouble I can't fix with a hammer and a level head. By the middle of October, I'd made up my mind. 3 months is the line. I've been a landlord long enough to know that if you let it go past 3, it becomes 4, then 5, then you're paying for someone else's life while your own slips sideways. I printed a 3-day pay or quit notice at the kitchen table. Standard form. It said she had 3 days to pay what she owed or vacate the cottage. Simple, legal, fair. That's what I told myself. I rehearsed what I'd say on the walkover, something firm but not mean. I'd tell her she'd been behind 3 months and I had to ask her to leave. I'd say it standing up straight, looking her in the eye, with no apologies and no long explanations, just the facts and paper. That's how my father would have done it. He believed in doing things clean. The morning was cool and gray, the kind of October light that makes everything look like it's holding its breath. The oak tree between the two buildings had started to turn, the leaves going brown and gold at the edges. I walked across the grass with the notice in my hand, and I remember thinking that the cottage looked different. The little flower box under the front window had mums in it, orange and rust, and the sight of them made me slow down for a second because I hadn't put them there and they weren't there before she moved in. I knocked on the door and waited, hearing movement inside a drawer, closing, footsteps on the wooden floor. The door opened, and there she was. She looked tired, and not the kind that sleep fixes. The kind that settles into the lines around the eyes and the set of the shoulders, the kind that comes from carrying something too long. A faded sweater hung loose on her, and her hair was pulled back and she looked smaller than I remembered, smaller than the woman who left jam on my porch and walked home alone in the dark. She looked at the paper in my hand, and she didn't look surprised. She'd been waiting for this moment. She knew it was coming the way you know, rain when the sky goes dark. She didn't take the notice, didn't reach for it, didn't step back, didn't ask for more time. She just looked at me, and then she said something I wasn't ready for. Can I offer you something different instead? Her voice was steady, no tremble, no tears, and her hands hung at her sides without fidgeting or gripping the doorframe. She was just standing there, looking at me like she'd been thinking about this for a while. I didn't say anything. I should have handed her the paper and walked back to my empty kitchen, but I didn't. I stood there, and I waited. She said she couldn't pay rent in cash right now, and she knew that, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But she said she could take care of the house, cook and clean, and keep the yard the way I kept it, keep the cottage and the main house in shape, and then she said it again, the part that made my hand tighten around the notice. She said she'd take care of me, too, if I'd let her. It wasn't a joke or flirtation or desperation dressed up as something else. It was a woman standing in her doorway with nothing left to lose and one honest card left to play. I could see that much. She wasn't trying to charm me. She was offering what she had. I told her I'd think about it. I walked back across the yard with the notice still in my hand, And I went inside and sat at the kitchen table for the first time in 5 years. I sat there for a long time, staring at the paper on the table in front of me, and I thought about the jam and the thank you note and the way she'd planted mums under the window of a place she might not be allowed to stay. That night I didn't sleep. I kept hearing her voice. Take care of the house. Take care of me. The words sat in the dark with me like something that had been missing and finally showed up at the wrong time. 2 days later, I knocked on her door again, not with the notice this time, just with my hands in my pockets and a few ground rules I'd written on the back of an old grocery list. I told her she could keep the cottage and she'd take care of the main house, cooking, cleaning, the yard, whatever needed doing. Dinner twice a week at first, more if it made sense. And if either of us wanted out, we just said so. No notice required, no hard feelings, no long goodbye. She agreed, standing in the doorway, with her arms crossed, and when I finished talking, she nodded once and said fair. That one word did something to me, because it was the same way my father used to agree to a deal, simple and final, and it made me feel like I wasn't making a mistake. The first week was awkward. She came over in the morning to make coffee before I left for work. I'd hear her in the kitchen while I was pulling on my boots in the hallway, and I didn't know what to do with my hands while she moved around like she already knew where everything was. The mugs were in the same cabinet, but she reached for them differently than I did, and every time she opened a drawer or set something down, the sound felt louder. I ate dinner at the table for the first time in 5 years, and the chair groaned under me like it had forgotten what weight felt like. She made pasta with red sauce and garlic bread. Simple food, nothing fancy. I sat in the chair that hadn't been moved since Karen left, and the table felt too big for one plate, but the food was warm, and the kitchen smelled like something other than whatever I'd heated in the microwave. I didn't know my own kitchen could smell like that. After dinner, she washed the dishes, and I dried them, and neither of us talked much. The silence was different from the silence I was used to. The silence I knew was empty, the kind that presses against you. This silence had someone else in it, and that made it softer, even if I didn't know what to call it yet. I told myself it was just business, a fair exchange. She needed a place to live, and I needed someone to make the house feel less like a storage unit for a life that had stopped moving. There was a leak in the cottage roof I'd been meaning to fix for weeks, and I kept telling myself I'd get to it next weekend. That's the kind of man I was. Always fixing something for someone else, always putting off the thing that needed fixing, closest to home. That's what I told myself about the arrangement, too. I was wrong, but I didn't know it yet. 3 weeks in, something happened that I wasn't prepared for. On a Sunday, I woke up to something I hadn't heard in this house in a long time, the sound of someone else being awake before me. The smell of coffee drifting down the hallway, and underneath it, something sweet, something baking. I walked to the kitchen in my socks and stood in the doorway. She was at the stove, bare feet on the tile, hair still damp from the shower, humming something I didn't recognize. She had a dish towel over her shoulder, and she was sliding a tray of blueberry muffins out of the oven. The kitchen was warm in a way it hadn't been since I couldn't remember. I stood there watching her longer than I should have. I noticed the way she reached for the high shelf without a stool, the way her sweater pulled at her waist when she stretched. I noticed the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when it fell forward, and the way she moved between the counter and the stove like the space belonged to her. I noticed all of it, and then I noticed myself noticing, and that was the part that made my throat go tight. She turned and saw me in the doorway. She smiled, the kind of smile that carries no expectation. "Morning," she said. like it was the most natural thing in the world to be standing in my kitchen making muffins on a Sunday. I sat at the table. She put a plate in front of me, and when she set it down, her fingers passed close to mine. Not touching. Almost. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of her hand near my knuckles. I picked up the muffin and didn't say anything about it. She sat across from me with her own plate and her own cup of coffee, and we ate without talking about the arrangement. We talked about the weather instead, and about the oak tree dropping leaves on the grass between the houses, and about whether the porch needed repainting before winter. Small talk that felt like something bigger because of the way she looked at me when she laughed at my joke about the paint store. It didn't feel like business anymore, but neither of us was going to say that out loud, not yet. And because neither of us said it, the thing between us kept growing in the silence, the way weeds grow through cracks in a driveway, quiet and stubborn and impossible to pull out without breaking something. About a month in, on a warm evening near the end of November, I found her sitting on the porch steps. She had a cup of tea between her hands, and she was watching the sky go orange and purple over the rooftops. I came out to get the mail and ended up sitting down beside her without deciding to. It just happened. The way things happen when you stop thinking and let your legs carry you somewhere. For a while we didn't talk. The porch light was on, and the air smelled like dry leaves and the last of the season's cut grass. Then she started talking, and not about the house or the yard or the arrangement. She talked about herself. She told me she grew up in a town called Millhaven, 2 hours north. Her mother died when she was 19. Cancer. Fast. The kind that doesn't give you time to prepare for the shape it leaves in a house. Her father had been gone before, that left when she was 7. She'd been on her own since her mother passed, working whatever job would take her, moving whenever the rent went up, or the job fell through. She came to Ridgewood because it was far enough from Millhaven that the memories didn't follow her as close, and she got the job at Rosie's and was doing okay until her car broke down in July and the repairs wiped out 2 months of savings. That's why the rent stopped, not because she was careless or avoiding me, but because she was choosing between a running car and a place to sleep. And she picked the car because the car got her to work. I listened. I didn't offer advice. I didn't tell her it would be okay or that things have a way of working out. I just sat next to her on the steps and let the silence hold what she'd said. That felt like the right thing to do. Sometimes the only honest thing you can give someone is the weight of your attention. Then she asked about me, about Karen. I told her the truth, the short version. She left because I was too quiet, because I didn't know how to need anyone, because I made her feel like she was talking to a wall. I said it flat, without self-pity. The way you describe a house you used to live in, it's not yours anymore, but you remember where the rooms are. She looked at me for a long time, her tea cooling in her hands. Then she said, very quietly, "Maybe you just hadn't met someone worth needing yet." I didn't answer. I didn't move away either. We sat there on the porch while the light faded and something shifted in the space between us, not a confession or a touch, just two people recognizing the same old wound in each other and deciding, without saying it out loud, that they weren't going to run from it. But the distance was getting harder to keep, and we both knew it, even if neither of us was ready to cross it. 5 weeks in, and the line between business and something else had gotten so thin, I could feel it every time she was in the room. On a Thursday night, she was in my kitchen cleaning up after dinner. I was at the table, pretending to look at something on my phone, but I was watching her. I'd gotten good at that, watching without looking like I was watching. She reached for a plate on the high shelf above the refrigerator. She couldn't get it. Her fingers brushed the edge and came up short. I got up without thinking about it and stepped behind her to grab it. I reached over her head, my arm close to her shoulder, and for a moment I was near enough to sense her through her sweater. She didn't move, didn't step aside or lean away. My hand was on the shelf. Her breathing changed. I could hear it just slightly. The way it got a little faster and a little deeper. I could see the pulse in her throat, a small, quick movement under her skin. I pulled the plate down and handed it to her over her shoulder. Our fingers touched that time for real. Not almost, and her fingertips grazed my knuckles in a contact that was light and brief, but moved through me like a current through old wiring. Sudden and warm. Said something about the rain coming in tomorrow. She nodded and said something about the gutters, and neither of us mentioned what had just happened. But that night I lay awake in the dark, thinking about the way she hadn't moved away, and the way her breathing changed, and the way her fingers had lingered on mine for just a fraction of a second longer than they needed to. The next morning, she was quieter than usual. Her hands shook when she poured my coffee, just a little, and she didn't look at me when she set the cup down. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what, and the silence between us had changed from something comfortable to something charged. It was like standing next to a wire you know is live. You don't touch it, but you don't step away either. We kept the distance after that for a while, but the distance was a lie we were both telling, and it was only a matter of time before something cracked it open. A bad storm rolled in on a Saturday night, about 6 weeks into the arrangement. The forecast had called for heavy rain, but this was something else. The wind came up fast and hard, bending the oak tree almost flat, and by 9 o'clock the power was out across the whole neighborhood. I was sitting in the dark, a flashlight on the table, when I heard her knock. Not on the cottage door. On my back door. I opened it, and she was standing on the step, soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, her jacket dark with rain. She was shivering. "The cottage is flooding," she said. "The roof leak. The one you said you'd fix. It's coming through the ceiling, above the bed. I'd been meaning to fix that leak for 2 months. I had the shingles in the garage. I just hadn't gotten to it. I told myself I'd do it next weekend, the way I'd told myself the weekend before, and the one before that. Now she was standing on my porch in a storm, because I'd put it off. I brought her inside, found towels in the bathroom, handed her a dry flannel of mine to change into, lit candles on the kitchen table and a living room windowsill. The house was warm and small, and lit by the glow on the walls, and the rain hammered the roof so hard it sounded like 100 hands drumming. She came back from the bathroom in my flannel. It was too big for her, the sleeves past her wrists, the hem past her thighs. She looked like someone borrowing another person's life for the night. She was still shivering, so I put a blanket around her shoulders, and my hand lingered on the fabric. I could feel the shape of her underneath, thin and tense, and I pulled my hand back before I held on too long. We sat on the couch. No television, no music, just the rain on the roof and the candlelight moving on the walls. She pulled her knees up under the blanket and leaned against the arm of the couch. And somewhere in the second hour, she drifted off. Her head tilted sideways and came to rest against my shoulder. I didn't move. For 2 hours I sat there with her weight against me, and the storm outside and the candles burning low. I watched the rain on the window and felt the slow, even rhythm of her breathing. And I thought about how long it had been since another person had been close enough to fall asleep on me. 5 years longer, maybe. I couldn't remember the last time Karen had done it. When she woke, she looked up at me in the candlelight. Our faces were close enough that I could see the small scar on her chin, close enough that I could count her eyelashes if I'd wanted to. She whispered, "Thank you for letting me in." I said, "You were already in." She closed her eyes again and leaned back against my shoulder, and I sat there in the dark with the rain and the warmth of her beside me, and I knew something had changed. The careful distance we'd been keeping had cracked open, and I didn't know how to build it back, even if I'd wanted to. 2 weeks after the storm, and I couldn't pretend anymore that what was happening between us was just an arrangement. She stayed later at my house after dinner, and I found reasons to be home when she came over in the morning, lingering in the kitchen longer than I needed to, finding small jobs to do in whatever room she was in. We'd found a rhythm that felt less like a deal and more like something that had grown on its own, but then everything that had been building quietly got thrown into the open when a man showed up at the cottage one evening. I saw him from the kitchen window, tall, well-dressed, the kind of man who presses his shirts and wears cologne to a hardware store. He was standing at the cottage door, and when Evelyn opened it, he stepped forward, like he expected to be invited in. She didn't let him. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, shaking her head at something he was saying. I watched from the window. My jaw tightened. I didn't go outside. I told myself it wasn't my business. But I didn't look away either. I watched the way he leaned toward her, the way she held her ground, the way her face was set in an expression I hadn't seen before, something between anger and exhaustion. After about 10 minutes, he left. He walked to a clean sedan parked on the street and drove away. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a while after, just standing there with her arms still crossed, staring at the empty space where his car had been. She came straight to my back door without knocking, just stood on the step with the porch light on her face, waiting. I opened it. She said, "That was Derek, my ex. He wants me to go back to Portland with him." I asked what she wanted. I kept my voice even, but my hands were in my pockets, and my fists were clenched, and I couldn't feel my fingertips. She looked at me for a long time. The porch light was between us, and her eyes held mine, and there was something in her expression that wasn't asking for permission or looking for reassurance. It was steadier than that, more certain. "I don't want Portland," she said. I nodded. She went back to the cottage, and I stood in the doorway for a long time after, watching the porch light and thinking about the way my chest had gone tight when she said Derek's name. I hadn't felt anything like that in 5 years. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be afraid of losing something you weren't even sure you had. And the worst part was, I still didn't know if she was staying for me or for the cottage and the deal. She'd said she didn't want Portland, but that wasn't the same as saying she wanted this. A few days after Derek left, she came to make dinner like usual, but I could see something was building in her, the way pressure builds before a storm breaks. She moved around the kitchen the same way she always did, pulling plates from the cabinet, filling the pot with water, setting the table for two. But there was a weight in the way she set things down, a deliberateness, like each motion cost her something. She set the food on the table. We sat. She pushed a piece of chicken around her plate with her fork for a full minute without taking a bite. Then she said, "I need to tell you something. The real reason I proposed the arrangement." I set my fork down. The kitchen was quiet, except for the fridge humming and the clock over the stove ticking. She said the real reason went deeper than the rent, deeper than having a place to stay, and deeper than the car repairs wiping out her savings, though that was true too. She'd been watching me before any of that happened, before she fell behind. "I'd see you in the yard," she said, "fixing things early in the morning before the rest of the town woke up. I'd see you come home alone every night, the same time, the same way. I'd see the way you kept everything so careful and so clean, the porch swept, the gutters clear, the paint touched up even when nobody was looking." She stopped, took a breath. Then she went on. "And I thought, that's a man who knows how to take care of things. That's a man who pays attention. And I thought maybe if someone took care of him for once, he wouldn't look so alone. She said Derek never really noticed anything about her because he saw what he wanted to see, the version that fit into his life, the pretty girl at the diner who laughed at his jokes and didn't ask for much. He never saw the way her hands cracked in the winter from the dishwater, or the way she read library books until 2 in the morning because sleep didn't come easy, or the way she kept the cottage neat because disorder made her chest tight. She saw me, the real version, the one who works with his hands and eats, standing up and keeps the porch light on for someone who isn't coming home. She saw that and she chose to stay, not for the cottage, not for the deal, but for me. I went quiet, my throat tight, and my hands flat on the table, and I didn't know what to do with them. I'd spent 5 years believing I was the kind of man who was too quiet to be needed, too still to be wanted, and Karen told me that, and I'd carried it like a fact, the same way I carry the mortgage and the repairs and the morning routine. And here was this woman, this young woman who walked home in the dark and left jam on my porch, telling me that the very thing I thought was wrong with me was what she saw and wanted. I didn't say anything for a long time after that, just sat there across from her at the table while the kitchen light flickered once and the clock ticked, and I let the truth of what she said settle into me like rain into dry ground. That same night, after she told me why she really stayed, after the kitchen went quiet and the only sound was the clock and my own breathing, I sat across from her and tried to find the words, "I'm not good at this." Karen told me that more than once, and she was right. I don't know how to say what I feel until it's already been sitting in me so long it starts to ache. But I tried because I owed her that much. I told her I didn't let her stay because I needed someone to cook or clean or tend the yard. Anybody can hire that kind of help. I let her stay because the house felt different the first morning. She made coffee, and I didn't know what to do with that feeling, so I called it practical and left it alone. I told her I'd been afraid since that first morning. Afraid that if I said what I actually wanted, she'd walk out the door and the cottage would go back to empty, and the kitchen would go back to quiet, and I'd be right back where I started, except worse, because now I'd know what I was missing. She asked what I actually wanted. I said, you, not the arrangement, not the rent, you. The words came out quiet, barely above a whisper, the way the most honest things do. I wasn't looking at her when I said it. I was looking at the table, at my hands, at the grain in the wood. But I felt her reach across the space between us. She took my hand. Her fingers were warm and sure, and she held on, and neither of us moved. The kitchen light flickered again, and the refrigerator hummed, and outside the night was still and cold, and inside the kitchen was something I hadn't felt in so long I'd forgotten it had a name. It wasn't a kiss or confession scene from a movie. Just 2 people sitting at a table in a small house on a quiet street, holding hands, with nothing left to pretend about. And it was enough. More than enough. She squeezed my hand once, gently, and said, "Took you long enough." I almost laughed. It came out more like a breath, short and surprised, the way laughter does when you're not expecting it, and your chest is full. And for the first time since Karen left, I felt like the kitchen table was the right size for 2. The weeks after that were different. The arrangement was over, but nothing really changed on the outside. She still made coffee in the morning. I still fixed things around the house. She still cooked, and I still ate at the table, but the pretense was gone, and the space it left behind filled with something real. When she reached for the high shelf now, I didn't step behind her carefully. I walked up and wrapped my arm around her waist and grabbed whatever she needed, and she'd lean back against me for a second before taking it. Small things. The kind of things that don't mean anything to anyone else, but mean everything when you spent 5 years without them. The house sounded different, footsteps that weren't just mine, a voice in the kitchen that wasn't the radio, music sometimes from her phone, something soft and old while she folded laundry at the table, the creak of the floorboards in the hallway at night when she walked from the bathroom to the bedroom, and the sound of her breathing beside me in the dark when the house settled into sleep. One afternoon, I came home from a job, a broken porch railing on Elm Street that took longer than I'd estimated, and I found her on the couch. She was reading a library book, her legs tucked under her, one of my old flannels over her shoulders like a blanket. Her hair was loose and falling over the collar, and the afternoon light was coming through the window and touching the side of her face. I stopped in the doorway, the same way I'd stopped that first Sunday morning when she was making muffins. But this time, I didn't just watch. I walked over and sat beside her on the couch, and the cushion dipped under my weight, and she looked up from her book. I took the book out of her hands gently and set it on the table. Then I pulled her close. She came easily, like she'd been waiting for me to do it, and she fit against me the way a key fits a lock, the way something is supposed to fit when you've been trying the wrong ones for a long time. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic, just the quiet of two people in a small house who finally stopped pretending, and the afternoon light, and the feeling that whatever this was, it was the most honest thing that had happened in this house since it was built. I thought about Karen sometimes, and she said I was too quiet, too still, and she was right about one thing because I was quiet, but she was wrong about what it meant. I wasn't empty, and I wasn't a wall. I was just waiting for someone who understood that silence isn't the same as nothing, that a man who doesn't say much can still feel more than he knows how to carry, and the right person doesn't need you to be loud. She just needs you to be there. A Saturday morning, months later, the light comes through the kitchen window the way it always does, soft and angled, hitting the table at the same spot. She's at the stove, scrambling eggs the way I like them, firm and plain, no cheese, no pepper. I'm at the table with my coffee, watching her move between the stove and the counter, and I'm thinking about a piece of paper I printed at this same table almost a year ago. The eviction notice. 3-day pay or quit. I never served it. It's still in the kitchen drawer, the second one from the right, under the tape and the batteries in the takeout menus I never throw away. Sometimes I open that drawer and look at it. Not often, but sometimes I look at it the way you look at an old photograph of a life you almost lived, the one where you made a different choice and everything went the other way. She sets a plate in front of me and catches me staring. She smiles, the same smile from that first Sunday morning, the one that carries no expectation. "What?" she says. I shake my head. "Nothing." But I'm thinking about what would have happened if I'd handed her that notice. The cottage empty. Again, the flower box under the window with no one to plant mums, the kitchen table with one plate, the porch light on every night for no one. The house quiet the way it was for 5 years, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, the kind that feels like a room you forgot to walk into. She sits across from me with her own plate. She reaches for my hand across the table the same way she did the night we told each other the truth. I hold on. Her fingers are warm and sure, and the eggs are hot, and the coffee is strong, and the morning is quiet in the best way, the way that means someone else is there. The porch light is still on when I leave for work in the dark. It's on when I come home, and this time, someone is coming home to it. The house isn't quiet anymore. It's full of small sounds and small gestures, and the kind of warmth that comes from two people who chose each other on purpose. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It's enough. The eviction notice is still in the drawer. I'll probably never throw it away. It reminds me of how close I came to choosing the quiet over everything that came after. And every time I look at it, I think about the woman who didn't cry, didn't beg, and offered me something I didn't know I was waiting for. If you want more stories from the porch, subscribe.